welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by a screenwriter and a novelist who is here to discuss an absolutely um, a blast of a read. It's a little mix of sci-fi and noir and a whole bunch of other really cool stuff. So let's get into it. Welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Well, the book's called Shadow of the Eternal Watcher. I think you nailed it. It's a noir crime thriller that spirals into a big action sci-fi adventure by the end of it. So it's a lot of the things that I grew up loving to read and loving to watch on the big screen too. So this is kind of the culmination of lots of things that Josh likes to think about in stories. So I think I'm glad you said it was a blast because that's what I was going for. I just wanted to be a fun page turner that hopefully really digs into a character too that's got a lot of flaws and different interesting things to explore on the page too.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get too much into Duster Rains and his adventures here, I'd love if we could talk a little bit about your career and your journey to the book. Because I know that you've also written for the screen and worked in film. Could you talk a little bit about your route toward this project, as it were?
Yeah, definitely. Well, when I first got into writing, I was an undergrad at Stanford and was taking a lot of creative writing classes. And when I was in high school, I was like, I'm going to write books. I'm going to be a novelist. And when I was actually at Stanford, I'd write these stories, and a lot of people would be like, "Oh, wow, like what's going on here? This is such a." They would describe it essentially saying, "Oh, it's such a visual thing you're writing here." Because I was sort of imagining, essentially, what I came to realize, I was kind of imagining camera positions and things spinning around people. I'm like, "Oh, you got to imagine it like this." And I actually took a film class at Stanford, and we were watching Citizen Kane, and there's a scene in Citizen Kane. The part that jumped out to me is so innocuous. He walks up to a pole and actually spins around this pole, and they match cut. They're behind him. He walks up the pole, he grabs the pole, he spins, and then all of a sudden they're in front of him.
Mhm.
And I grew up loving movies. My dad's a big cinephile. I don't think he realized it, but we watched movies a lot in my house. And it never really occurred to me that people make movies. The movies were just these things that you enjoyed and you consumed. And sitting in that room, I was like, oh wow, well, I could do that. I could put the camera there and kind of do that. So I kind of put what was the novel dream aside and started really focusing on film. And I went to USC. I got a master's at USC. I'm a screenwriter and a director. My first feature film came out a few years ago. It's called What Still Remains, which sort of is in the same vein as the book. I like genre mashups. So that movie, if you just looked at it, you're like, oh, it's a dystopian. Maybe there's monsters, maybe there's not, but end of the world kind of thing. But really, what that movie is to me is it's a family melodrama and a coming of age story for a young woman, and then it's wrapped up in these dystopian clothes to kind of just have fun with it. And that's sort of how I saw this movie. It's about, I mean, this book is that it's about this flawed individual. He's a detective, which kind of gets back to the film class and the noir. I've always loved film noir. So I was like, well, I love film noir. If I had this detective and exploring him, I could get into the close of a sci-fi book, which is what I always grew up reading and loving. So that's kind of where that came from. And basically, to answer your original question, how did the book come about? The movie was coming out. I write a lot of scripts. I have tons of scripts out there. They're being shot by my manager, but I had an idea for what has become Shadow of the Eternal Watcher. And the more I thought about it, I'm like, I'm playing in these lower budget worlds of movies, so I don't think I'm going to get to make that movie. And yeah, maybe I could sell this script, but this would be a big movie. And a lot of times when you go into pitch movies, people are like, oh, I wish we had IP. I wish we had intellectual property. And I was like, maybe I should just make my own intellectual property and get back to what I originally wanted to do, which was write books. Because when I was a kid, I always sat in the bookstore and I would look at the authors' names and see where my name would go when my book came out, who I would be between. And I don't feel like, oh, I'd be by Herman Melville, but obviously this book won't be by Herman Melville because it's a science fiction book, but that's that was always the kid Josh dream. So getting back to that and flexing those old muscles of how I originally studied too, which was fun. So got to kind of relearn some of the things I unlearned for screenwriting because you don't get as much space in a screenwriting format. So kind of gained to expand back out and flex those muscles too, which was a lot of fun.
Nice. Yeah, that's a really interesting point because I've often, asked authors about writing for the screen versus the page. And I've always thought about like the freedom that a novel allows you in terms of like there are fewer voices and fewer other influences telling you what to do and to shape your story for marketing purposes or what have you. But also, like as you mentioned, there are no budgetary constraints for a novel. Like you you don't have to worry about the CGI budget and paying animators and all that. So yeah, it's a totally new way for me to think about that. Um, so when it came to writing this book, um, what sort of new skill sets or perhaps old skill sets from when you were writing novels and stories before, like how did it stretch you creatively?
Yeah, so I mean, being a screenwriter, I think a lot about structure. So because screenplays are hyper structured, and so are books. But like screenplays, it's like on this page, this needs to happen. That's kind of the rule, and you then learn those rules and you break them and you expand and you contract them. But there's midpoints, there's point of attack. So taking that kind of structure mindset to the book I think was useful because it allowed me. I treat each chapter kind of like how I imagine scenes, and like what's my way into this chapter? What's the main character point? What are we trying to accomplish in this chapter? And then what's my out too? So just thinking a lot about getting in and out of chapters, which is when I read a book, I really enjoy almost, I guess, for lack of a better term, the cliffhanger chapter, right? When I read to my kids at night and we get to the end of a chapter and they're upset we're stopping because it's time for bed and they want to keep going, that's good writing. So just trying to not necessarily unlearn anything, but take those skills and then spin them on their head and use them for the book too. And you spoke to it. I mean, you certainly get more space and more freedom in a book, but I always say it can be a trap too, because I think there's nothing I hate more than books that just expound for hundreds of pages and nothing's happening because I like plot. So I'm like, well, what's the balance between world building and plot too, and trying to find that sweet spot because I definitely love world building, but I also want things to happen, and I'm very focused on character and driving character forward too. So it's really important to me that Duster Rains have a journey, and that we get to know him, and then by the end, even if you don't agree with everything he's done, you kind of maybe have a different understanding of where he's coming from, and hopefully want to see what he does next too.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought up both character and world building because this novel made me really interested in how those things work together.
Mm-hmm.
Because you do a lot of both sci-fi and noir world building, for mood and also for like how the things happening in the world around them affect character decisions and things like that. So when it comes to like the world that you built for him to inhabit and Duster Reigns, um, which came first? Like, was it the character
Mm-hmm.
that sort of shaped the world building, or did the world shape the character, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Well, when I first started, I just had the vision of what became chapter one. There's a prologue to when you read the book eventually, but chapter one was where I started. I just had this vision of him. Like I said, I'm a visual guy, so I could see him inebriated, sort of drunk, driving to a bar and going to solve this case. And at that point, I was like, what's the case? What's he doing? But I could just see this character. I could see that visual and him stopping and looking at this neon sign for this, what is it says his favorite water. So the bar, right? And then, like we said, noir and sci-fi both have these tropes, right? So for me, it was fun to kind of dig in and be like, all right, he's the pulpy detective, and he takes no nonsense, and he's kind of using these one-liners, but it's the 21st century, so why is he talking like that? But making it make sense in the 21st century, but having fun with those tropes, and then bringing in the tropes of sci-fi, and then also how do I make it unique and how do I make it different? And with that, I thought it was the character and his story as he got fleshed out, and then moving him through this world, it sort of starts to inform the world. And sometimes you get you go back, I'm a big believer in getting words on the page because it's always easier to fix things later. So you go back and you're like, oh, I can't really visualize this. What's happening here? It was just plot. So building the world. And sometimes I would go back and be like, oh, I love everything I wrote in here. It's really cool, but like this chapter is really long and I think people are going to get bored. So I got to like get back to what I originally said, which was what's drive this character for. It's not just about describing buildings and having them look cool. It has to be a balance of the two. And I think the screenwriting did help me with that because in screenwriting, obviously, eventually there's going to be a movie, so you have to paint a picture for people who are reading so they can imagine what that movie will be. But you got to keep it going because you only have 120 pages max, probably more like 90 to 100. So I think that helped me with this too, and the balance and going back and editing what's important and cleaning it up and hopefully still building quite the world, but also just having a pit. I really wanted to be a pithy page turner too. So I was trying to find that balance. I want this to be a 700-page sci-fi book. I wanted it to be like that 300-page mystery novel too.
Mm. Yeah, the pacing is really what like I think for me helps to accomplish the perfect balance as it were of like the mystery and the sci-fi or the noir and the sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
Um I'm glad that you talked about drafting too, because I love to talk to writers about process. And with this book in particular, you have a lot of plates that you are spinning and
Mm-hmm.
keeping spinning. You have the murder case, and you have, I'm going to try to stay vague so I don't spoil things for people, but you have, you know, alternate realities and time travel and big action sequences and, dimensional twins and all these really cool concepts. Like how different was your end product from that first draft?
Yeah.
And what does it take to keep that many plates spinning while you keep, the sort of uh, the pace that keeps the reader hooked?
Yeah, I think my first draft definitely. I'm not a big outliner. I take notes, and they wouldn't make sense to most people, but they make sense to me. I definitely outline a lot in my head. I don't spend a lot of time writing like a 75-page outline. I sort of like to find the story as I go, which can maybe make it take a little longer, but I also think sometimes it gives you a little more freedom to then follow something, go back and edit. Um, but to me, it's like a big puzzle. So you start going, you're going through, and maybe that interesting thing with the alternate reality stuff starts to happen, which was always the plan. But my thing was I wanted to do something different. I just didn't want to do the what's become the Marvel thing, right? Where it's everyone's got the same person. And really for me, it was more when I was writing this, that wasn't as big yet, but I was back more in the Star Trek world of Mirror Mirror. I mean, that's where this came from, is like that. I grew up, I love Star Trek, love Star Wars, read all those novels. So there was a lot of fun doppelganger novels of that Star Trek expanded universe. And they don't do that as much in Star Wars, but so I was like, well, how do I make this different? So I was playing with this idea of rather than everyone having the double, just certain people having the double. So as I came to that conclusion, then it was fun to go back and be like, well, what if this person who we met on page 10 is actually more important and they have a double? So, you kind of, you write something and then you go back and make it seem like you were really smart and had the plan the whole time, right? So, so there's a give and take where I don't think you can be too wed to your plan when a good idea presents itself. So I always try to be open to, oh, well, that's a really cool idea. Okay, so how do I go back and how do I make this work through it? And I don't like to throw things out. So I definitely go through and just, like I said, I can really track it in my mind. So that helps when I go back and start fixing things. And, every time you read it, you're like, oh man, maybe I should tweak that a little more. And at a certain point too, you gotta be like, all right, let's push this out there and maybe do something different too and write something else, right?
Or yeah, and there's like a very impressive type of like sleight of hand that has to happen there, because you have to like do the signposting. You have to set up the thing that's
Mm-hmm.
going to do the payoff, but you also can't make too big a deal that you're doing that, right? So there is
Yeah.
this sort of like you have to put it out there, but also like obscure it a little bit. I'm very interested in how like, in some ways that's easier in a movie because you do have things like camera perspective and you can shift the viewer's attention. I guess like
Mm-hmm.
movies let you control the attention, I guess, of your audience a little bit more perhaps than books. Hmm.
Yeah, and definitely you notice that, and I would say this too about movies. You plan and you plan and you plan and you execute, and then you let people watch it. and people surprise you, and you're like, that's not what you're supposed to be paying attention to. Why are you talking about that? That's not important. And it's like, well, that's like a really minor thing. We did this other thing. And it's the true in the book too, where it's like, I definitely think of things in movies. I'm like, okay, well, I would do a close up on the item to be like, don't forget about the key. It's really important. So it's like, well, how do you draw attention to this thing? Sleight of hand in the book now. And they're the same ideas. They're just different techniques, right? Because you definitely have to remind your readers too, and make sure they remember that, hey, remember that thing I talked about 150 pages ago? That was sort of important, and it's back now. I hope you're okay with that. And I'm sure when people read it, a lot of people will hopefully like it, and then there'll be people, they say different things, and I, as a writer, definitely take those things and internalize them and say, all right, well, next time I'm going to remember that. And I definitely learned a lot of things when I made my movie, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot. And I already have learned a lot from people reading the book too. So it's you grow and you proceed through your craft too. And I don't think you're going to be afraid of the mistakes, but you also have to always, for me, always thinking about your audience. What are they going to perceive? I think first and foremost, I wrote the story for myself. I was like, this will be really cool. And then I wrote it because I want people to read it, right? So I was like, well, how do I entertain people? How are people going to perceive this? Oh, this beta reader read it and they didn't really like this, and don't necessarily take their note, because I think a lot of times people like get obsessed with like, well, they said I should do this, I'm going to do that. It's like, well, now listen to what they were bothered by, and then you as the writer say, okay, well, they said X, and I want them to think Y. So how do I get them to change to that? So what do I have to change to make that clearer? Because it's more about what you want as the storyteller to convey.
I'm so sorry that we got so mired in process, 'cause I'm so
No, I like process.
But let's get back to Duster Raines a little bit. He is such a great character, and I really do love the very noir, reminiscent, like snappy dialogue. And he does have a lot of lines that, like, I was thinking, like, oh, if this was a movie, this would be a great, like, little button on that scene, or like, like his cool moment before the camera shifts.
That's definitely the screenwriter in
Were there like and I'm curious about the sci-fi angle too, but like when you approach a new world like this and a new character, are you a writer who tends to like immerse yourself in other properties and like sort of absorb vibes and sort of like get a feel for things, or do you like cut off your influences and start fresh? I don't really know if I phrased that
No,
properly.
no, I get exactly what you're saying. Well, I immerse myself in vibes my entire life. I mean, no one can see it. We're audio, but I'm sitting in front of a lot of books, and I like to read. I love to watch movies. So I think I just internalize all these things, and good writing, and I think good filmmaking too is learning from other people, stealing what you like, and then making it your own and changing it too. So definitely, I was living in some vibes. I mean, I definitely read some noir, revisited some noir, revisited some sci-fi, and then I think what's fun too is you writing, and then you read other novelists or watch other movies, and you're like, well, I want to do it like that, but I love this, and it kind of helps you refine a passion for it, because sometimes it can be hard as a writer because you get a lot of no's too, and you start to get a little jaded. So it's like finding that joy of like, well, why did you like doing this in the first place? Like, what about storytelling really pulled you into this? And then that for me is exciting, is seeing like other people succeeding and doing cool stuff. And it's like, okay, well, now I'm going to add to that conversation too, and hopefully other people read it and it inspires their writing too, which is kind of like, I think, the conversation that goes on through the years of different writers and different artists.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of character, besides him, there's lots of great characters in this book. Also like I loved Juan, I loved Carla. Was there a character who was the easiest to connect with and find their voice? And on the flip side, was there someone who was the most challenging?
Mm-hmm. I mean, definitely, I think Raines was both easy and then also challenging, the main character, in that he's very different from me too. So like, I always think of writing as like how I approach actors when I direct too, is like immersing yourself in their point of view. So it's not necessarily what you would do or what you think is right. It's what this character does. And then maybe sometimes you go too far and someone will read it and be like, oh, this is terrible. I can't stand this guy. It's like, oh, I maybe went too far into that realm. Juan to me, I love Juan. I mean, he's like me mixed with my son and just like this kid who would, I just imagine he was taking apart his parents' computers when he was a kid. And that guy really spoke. He really spoke to me. And also Carla, she to me is like what I would be saying to Rains a lot of times too. So I like Carla too. And it's just like she's just the no nonsense, really strong female character who just unfortunately is attached to Rains in a lot of ways too, which doesn't really work out for her. But I think she could have her own story in her own movie too, and you'd enjoy chasing her around too. And maybe we'll get into a little more of her story in future tellings of Rains.
Oh, I hope so.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, and like, now that you were talking about it, you do, I think, need a character like Carla in order to make Duster Rains like a little bit more not acceptable, but maybe like sympathetic, in some
Mhm.
ways, because you need somebody to be like, no, to
Yeah.
shoot them and get a hold of yourself. Like if somebody can do that for you as an audience avatar, like that is, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's kind of the noir detective vibe too, is like they're all like about the case and they're like all about themselves and their trauma. And it's like, well, you're kind of like leaving this wake of destruction behind you too. And there are consequences to those actions. And I think that that's a main theme of this book too, is people, you can apologize for things, you can say, oh, I'm sorry, forgive me, but our actions and what we do in the past, that's all we have to build our lives on. Like those moments and those memories are reality. And you can try to gaslight people and try to apologize, but at a certain point that's reality and we have to live with it too. And I think this book tries to address that and also maybe try to change it too and see what the consequences of that are too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, as you were speaking, I was thinking too of like, this is one of my favorite noirs, even though it is like probably technically a neo-noir, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Like big Dolores vibes too, I think. Like just
Mm-hmm.
really, really great. And it's been such a pleasure to talk to you about this book and your work. What is next for you? What's on your horizon?
Yeah, so like I said, I have a few scripts that are floating around. So always trying to make that next movie and chase that. And I'm also writing another Duster Rains story. So I think hopefully people love this one and want to read it. But I think I like the world, I like the story, and I think there's more to talk about. So I definitely wrote it thinking there would be more. So I'm making there be more now. And
Yes.
I also have an idea. I mentioned my kids. I have a soon to be 10-year-old, soon to be 8-year-old. And I've really been just having such a blast reading them a lot of just YA middle grade books. So I have this sort of YA big epic sci-fi fantasy adventure that's spinning around in my head that I think I'm going to try to put pen to page and maybe make a younger version that my kids could read.
Nice. Yeah,
Yeah.
like the PG Duster Rains.
Yeah, PG Duster Rains,
Yeah.
exactly. the Harry Potter version of Duster
Yeah.
Rains.
Oh, well, thank you again. This has been really lovely, and I can't wait to, see what you do next. And, I hope I get to see what Duster Rains does next too. So
Thanks, Jen. I really enjoyed it. And thank you so much for taking the time to read the book and talking about it. It means a lot.
you're very welcome. Okay, listeners, it's on you now. Please check out Shadow of the Eternal Watcher. It's such a blast, as I said when we began. When you hear this, it will be out in the world. So go to your favorite independent bookstore, website, library, maybe, wherever you like to go for your books. All right, it is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.